Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. The fifth plenary session will begin in 1 minute. Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. The session will now begin. Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. The fifth plenary session will now begin. Ladies and gentlemen, the fifth plenary session, Economic Nationalism, a Moment or a Movement, will now begin.
Global leaders are increasingly embracing economic nationalism, and under current circumstances, this trend has the potential to become the dominant norm. Since the global financial crisis, developed economies have started to adopt inward economic policies as means of fostering recovery, resorting to protectionist trade measures as foundations of these strategies. The series of shocks witnessed by the global economy in recent years has fostered a conducive environment to protectionism, leading local governments to prioritize insulating themselves from global shocks and accentuating their economic sovereignty. What are the different layers of economic nationalism, and to what extent have recent shocks influenced the adoption of this policy shift? What ramifications does this trend hold for developing economies, and how can they shape their economic policies in response to these prevailing circumstances?
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage the moderator of the fifth plenary session, presenter at BBC News, Alan Kasuja.
I know it's after lunch, but I was hoping for a louder clap than that. Come on, man. That's better. That's better. My name is Alan Kasuja. Really good to have you here. Thank you very much. Sorry, you're saying something? You can improve. Oh, you can improve? We'll see about that later. Hopefully, I'll deserve the hand clap at the end of the session. Thank you. Thank you for coming in. Really good to see all of you. I hope lunch was good. And now we get into a discussion that I've been waiting to have for a while. Economic nationalism, a moment or a movement. Now, my typical style is to come to the audience as often as possible, so don't sit on your ideas. If you feel like you need to say something, put up your hand. Hopefully I'll see you and you can make your point. But this discussion is going to be led by an incredible panel. And I'd like to first of all introduce you to Dr. Abla Abdel Latif, who is the Executive Director and Director of Research at the Egyptian Center for Economic Studies. She comes up on stage now. Let's give her a round of applause. Dr. Harinder Kohli is Founding Director and Chief Executive, Emerging Markets Forum. He's making his way on stage at the moment. Let's give him a round of applause. And finally, Mr. Akebe. He's a former senior minister in Ethiopia, and he is currently British Academy Global Professor at the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London, SOAS. Let's give him a round of applause. When I saw these chairs, I knew the pictures aren't going to look great, but you know, we'll make it work. Thank you very much. Great to have everybody here. Going to start with you, Dr. Abdel Latif. Define it for us. When we say economic nationalism, what are we talking about? How do you understand it?
Okay, first of all, I would like to thank the organizers of the Atlantic Dialogue for inviting me to participate in this session. When we talk about economic nationalism is not a new term. It's a term that goes back actually to the 19th century. And at the time, the ideology or its philosophy was to help the weaker, the late starters, particularly agricultural economies, to be able to face the competition with the stronger countries. And so in that sense, we are talking about getting stronger and having growth, but not without hurting anyone. The economic nationalism that we are talking about now is actually coming from the developed countries who are not weak and definitely not starters, and it's associated with leaders, almost associated with individuals, more than actually being associated with policies. And so in that sense, it's a completely different type of economic nationalism. It might be the northern new version, let's say, of economic nationalism, and it is actually hurting not only the global south, as it's obvious because of disrupting their trade, investment potential, workers, etc., but it's also hurting the north itself. Okay, the countries themselves are hurt because of misallocation of resources and because of losing talent. And the global economy is also hurt because there is a lower equilibrium at the level of the entire world and misallocation of resources, not to mention that the global economy, the global world right now is facing lots of common challenges that require collaboration among everybody, and you cannot collaborate if you're not in a good position. Whether it's going to be permanent or temporary as a move, this depends on a lot of factors.
So it depends on a number of factors. I'll come back to you a bit later so you can expound on what you think will determine whether or not it becomes a movement. But I want to hear from you, Harinda. What's your interpretation of it? Is it aligned to what we've just had?
Yeah, I agree with Dr. Abdul Latif. It's not something terribly new. It goes back to ages, more than centuries actually. What is new is that since COVID and since some new leaders, including in the US where I live most of the time, President Trump, and leaders in countries like Turkey, the last president in Brazil, these days in China, there has been more assertive leadership emphasizing more national interest. And hence, what you said, is that a movement or is it a moment? In my view, it's not a one-way street. It goes back and forth. I think the main point I want to emphasize that we increasingly face problems, as we have heard in the last day and a half in this forum. We increasingly face problems which are global in nature. Climate change is just one, but not the only one. We are sitting in Africa, African continent, which suffers from tremendous problems of debt. The solution to the debt problems are not going to be national, they're going to be global. Migration is another problem where solutions are going to be global. So I can give you a long list of issues. We talked about multilateralism in the morning session, that it is weak, it's not fit for purpose today. Increasingly, the problems are going to be global, and climate change is the biggest of them. For those problems to be solved, we need multilateral solutions. Solutions cutting across nations, regional, continental, and global. So there is that tension. And fortunately, there are signs that the countries like the US are coming back to restarting alliances. And I think that's what we need to focus on. How to go beyond this trend towards nationalism and bring alliances together again and find global solutions. Right. I can come back and talk more about it.
Yeah, that's very
on.
interesting because you say the US is coming back, but who knows who's going to be the next president, because that could change the momentum that's been gained so far, right?
Exactly, but look at G20 meeting, which India led. India used to be considered, still considered many people, is emphasizing national interests, and yet it emphasized reform of the multilateral development banks. It talked about debt issues. It brought in African Union into G20. So, there's a back and forth, and we can talk more about it. You're right, there's a big danger what will happen in the election in the US next year. There's an election coming in Indonesia. And the elections in many, many countries. So this is the beauty and the danger of democracies.
Interesting. And Akebe, what do you think?
I think it's important to look at what are the key drivers of economic nationalism. If we look back during the global financial crisis in 2008, 2009, the world collaborated including G7, to ensure that the crisis, the damage of the crisis was contained. But after that, we have seen situations, and we have seen also this economic nationalism being popularized. There are three drivers for this. First is the rise of China, and actually the rise of Asia. If we look at the last few years, Asia is now the leading driver of global growth. In 2022, 50% of growth of global economy came from Asia, 35% by China and 15% by India. Second point, and this has really provoked the West to come up with a response. The second point is the global crisis have been repeated since 2020. The COVID crisis, the global pandemic, and then the economic recession. And this has provoked the state to play more important role. In the financial global crisis, austerity was the policy adopted. But during this crisis, all governments massively intervened, and then they took measures for economic recovery. And the third point is the rise of populism and also social media widespread use, and the fragmentation of electorates also contributed to national economy, to economic nationalism. I would like to later to comment because economic nationalism, how do you differentiate from industrial policy? Industrial policy has a component to build new industries, but also it may include some protective measures. And every country does that. So we have to differentiate which ones are the protective measures which are damaging and which are not damaging per se, but can contribute to global growth.
That's interesting. I'll come back to you and pick some more examples from you. But what about you, Doctor? What do you want to say?
Yeah, I want to add a few points in relation to what my colleague said here. First of all, the term economic nationalism, we cannot compare it to industrial policy as such because the name hides a lot. It hides ideology differences. It hides geopolitical differences, serious differences that are beyond just the economic relation. The West would like to see the earth open and swallow China, and they will live happily ever after, and hopefully China and Russia, but it's not going to happen. Yeah. Right? The nationalism started, re-emerged with China becoming a monster and difficult to control, and they were having problems coping with that. The shocks made it worse, but it started actually with China. India is taking this nice position of actually strengthening itself and yet keeping the global relations. I don't think the US will do that.
What about the internal politics of European countries, for example? A lot of them have been tending a bit to become a bit more inward-looking. That's not necessarily because of China, is it? Some of them will argue that it's because of migration and local politics.
Yeah, there is an issue in it that's beyond just the industrial policy situation. The migration is actually hurting the North, whether Europe or the US is shooting itself in the foot big time. The European population is aging. If they don't allow the migrants to come, they are going to suffer. So they are doing it for a different reason. I'm saying the term is actually an elegant term that hides bad policy, covering for ideology and geopolitical differences. But let me finish my point about India. India is taking this position. I doubt if the US is going to do the same, even if Trump doesn't come, because what Biden is doing is open the door a little bit for global collaboration, but he's messing up also. So if Trump comes, it's going to be a disaster, but the situation is already bad.
Do you agree?
Well, first, who knows what happens in elections next year? It's still 11 months away. I still am hopeful that we will not have Mr. Trump as a president. But there is a president of US and there is a Congress. And this jury is still out what will happen with the Congress. And there are checks and balances. But let's stay for a minute with the world as a whole. There is G20. And let's look at who is the presidency of G20 next year, Brazil. And that's a hopeful sign for me. We've gone from a very inward-looking nationalistic president in Brazil to a very different president with an open and fair election. Lula is back, who is putting a lot more emphasis on climate change. And he is going to emphasize, in my view, we have people from Brazil here, they can comment. He's going to emphasize social cohesion. And he hopefully will, under his presidency of G20, put much more emphasis on climate change and multilateral cooperation on climate change. Just the way Mr. Modi brought in African Union in G20, just the way European Union is a member of G20 in addition to 19 nations. And the agenda in Indian presidency was reform of the multilateral development banks and debt. Let's see what Brazilian presidency does, and I hope it will emphasize issues of importance to emerging markets, global south.
Right, and Marcus is here from Brazil. Can we get a microphone to him? Because I want you to process what you've just heard, and I'll invite you to talk in a moment. But before we come to...
I want to add just one other point,
yes,
because
yes.
China was mentioned. I was in China last month.
Yeah.
And I think if you look at China, China is slowly turning. China is the biggest polluter in the world today, because we talk about pollution as if it is still coming from the Western countries. That's no longer true. The biggest polluters are the so-called global south today. China is number one. US is second. India is third. And who else are the countries which burn coal, which are countries in the south, Indonesia and South Africa. So we have to look inwards also. That's what I call the solutions are going to be global.
Okay. I just want you to make a point really quickly before I come to Akebe. What you're going to say?
Yeah, no, because yes, this is what's happening now, but the historical accumulation of the carbon emissions is actually emerging from the West. We cannot put these on equal footing.
I agree, but we have to own what we can do ourselves.
No, there is a lot that needs to be done by the South.
We can't keep on complaining about the past. We have to take our destiny in our own hands and find common solutions.
And when we say we, who do you mean?
Emerging markets.
Emerging markets.
Right.
And I just want to pivot to Akebe and come back in. In this whole conversation, where do the emerging markets fit?
First, the economic nationalism, we have to relate it to the position in relation to multilateralism. We have been moving from a unipolar world towards a multilateral or multipolar world. And the expectation some 10 years back was that European Union will emerge as a major force, then the US, and then China. Of course, the last few years, we have seen that European Union is not showing bold moves as it was expected. But the key point is on the belief of multilateralism, and here also the emerging economies are operating through the global south cooperation as a response to the economic nationalism seen from the north. One point I want to highlight to the earlier point I mentioned in relation to industrial policy is we have been in recession in 2020, 2021. And all governments took measures for economic recovery. All these measures are not necessarily bad. And we have seen over $20 trillion allocated for stimulus. And if we only look at the US, we have seen the bipartisan acts of infrastructure bill. We have seen the Chips and Science Act. We have seen the Biden's IRA, Inflation Reduction Act. And there is a big part which is essential for the recovery. The problem arises with the issue of decoupling, or, as the Europeans want to say, de-risking, which focuses on restricting and putting restrictions rather than focusing on building the capability. We need to differentiate because every country, every economy, in a way, has a priority to build its own national economy, but it has to do it within accepted rules that the playing game becomes quite a fair play. So we need to differentiate this element, and the economic nationalism is also in a way structured. Let's look at what happened in this global tax convention, which was presented by African countries at the United Nations. And which countries objected to that? The issue was a fair issue that multinational corporations and transnational corporations should fulfill their responsibilities. It's a fair issue. And those who opposed it were the rich countries. So the issue is the economic nationalism is also in a way supported by these rich countries like G7 in a way that excludes developing and emerging economies.
That's very interesting. You want to say something, Dr. Abdulatif?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that the emerging markets are actually part of the global South. There's a very big, I agree with you, they have a very big responsibility in this whole thing. Lots of capacity building that is needed. It's a precondition for any good performance so that they can manage what's happening to them, the pressure they're receiving from the West. They have to diversify their markets. They have to find where they are competitive and improve their capabilities, benefit from the youth, etc., and benefit particularly from the platforms that exist right now for them. It's not going to happen often that you have G20 in India and then Brazil and then South Africa. This trio is not very easy, and if really the global South does not benefit from that, then chances are very far. And with the AU being a full-fledged member in G20, they have to push things, but they have to build themselves in order to be able to face the pressure caused by this nationalism.
So do you think Egypt and Ethiopia can set aside their challenges?
Yes, but we have in between India, so it's a great
so that you can get to some level of cooperation that benefits everybody.
We almost agreed on solving the problem inside, didn't we?
Yeah, so you see, if I may build on that point, Dr. Abdulatif's point, you know, Brazil has a presidency this year, and South Africa has a presidency next year.
Yeah.
So it's up to emerging markets to bring their agenda under their presidencies and push the solutions.
Okay, that's very interesting, but what are the practical steps to get to that point of presenting an agenda? Because what does that agenda look like? Because despite, we have varied differences, we have varied interests, how do you synchronize those to make sure that you maximize on the opportunity?
So look, there are three big issues in my mind, which are both global and of primary interest to emerging markets. Number one is climate change, because the countries which will be hurt the most, which are being hurt the most, are the poorest countries in the world, starting with Africa and Asia, whether it's droughts or floods or small islands. It is most urgent that the climate change issues are addressed. And it's not just issue of financing. In President Lula, we have a leader who has a deep interest in climate change, including forests in Amazon Basin, in Congo Basin, and in forests around Indonesia and that area. Well, that's an agenda, including financing, but beyond financing, which can be tackled in the G20 to help all of emerging markets. It's very urgent for us, our generation, our children's generation, our grandchildren. Second, debt is a serious issue. It's a ticking bomb. Without solving the debt issue, countries cannot invest and get private sector investment. That's an issue which needs to be tackled.
And do you think the current, again, this is a redundant question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Do you think that the current architecture of the financial infrastructure would allow for that debt situation to be resolved?
Well, that issue was discussed this morning, partly what to do with the multilateral financial institutions.
Right.
Okay. And
but isn't that, don't you agree, though, that that's quite something to overcome? It's a challenge to overcome if you're supposed to try to resolve the debt situation.
Okay, the elephant in the room, which was not discussed this morning because people were being polite, is China. The biggest debtor in the world, bilateral debtor in the world, is China, and China is unable to tackle the issue itself. Maybe at the G20 meeting in Brazil, that issue should be discussed up front, because until the Chinese agree to write down their debt, Africa's debt problem, Sri Lanka's debt problem, Pakistan's debt problem will not be solved. So that issue between the meeting in Brazil and South Africa needs to be tackled. Otherwise, Africa's debt problem will not be sorted out, and Asia's debt problem will not be sorted out.
Very strong.
Two examples.
Very strong. And third point?
Okay. The third problem is, how do you restore the flow of investments beyond just climate change? Infrastructure is an example. How do you bring private sector in? And that is all emerging markets, beginning again with Africa. Africa is the ultimate, in my view, and I've written about it, is the ultimate development frontier of the world. Unless we restore growth on a sustainable basis in Africa, rest of the world cannot be safe. It's not just a question of African people, it's the world problem.
Interesting. And Akebe, do you want to say something?
Yeah. I disagree with my colleague that China is an elephant in the room. I'm trying to look from a perspective of Africa. What Africa needs is to diversify its partnership, its traditional partnership with Europe, its partnership with the US, its partnership with emerging economies, not only China, but India, Turkey, Brazil, the global south. And this is absolutely important. And if we look at the data on the ground, for instance, debt stress, the main debt in Africa is not Chinese debt. Actually, IMF's report in 2022 shows that the number one is the private loans because of the US Federal Reserve interest rate has gone up, and also the US dollar has become expensive. It's the main burden in most African countries. And then the second one is the loans linked with multilateral organizations. So we need to bear this in mind. Let's give you an important evidence.
Are you basically disagreeing with the Chinese point that you made?
Yeah, the point I am highlighting is, actually China is part of the solution in an African context. I want to bring trade, for instance. Trade is an important element. In 2022, the trade between China and Africa was 282 billion. This is after COVID. Its trade with Europe is significant. Its trade with the US is significant. We need this diversification of trade. In terms of investment, Chinese investment is number 4 or number 5 after the US, UK, France, and the Gulf countries. We need more investment. So the key point is Africa, from its own interests and to emerge stronger, must engage in trade, attract investment, attract technology, to create jobs in the continent, and also has to closely work with the global south, and also work on the global collaboration requirement for the global issues like climate change or global pandemic, which require a joint collaboration. So,
isn't that process ongoing at the moment?
Yeah.
It's ongoing?
Yeah, it's ongoing.
But you think it needs to be accelerated, or?
It's being accelerated, and I see Africa's engagement with non-traditional partners is expanding, which is a blessing.
Okay. And Dr. Abdul-Latif, before I go to the audience, what do you want to say?
Yes, I have actually many comments on
Go on,
what
go on.
I heard. Number one, on the agenda, you said which agenda do they take to G20? There are symptoms and there is core problem. The climate issue, the debt, the poverty, they are all symptoms. The core problem is that the voice of the South is not heard and is not loud enough, and the division of power is leaning against it. okay? And so because of that, those issues are not addressed in the proper way. So it's important to look at them, but it's important to look at the root cause and see what can be done about it. When you talk about second point, you're talking about climate finance. I think what's more important than climate finance is the just transition, so that, because here, climate finance alone is simply looking at the climate issues, but the just transition is looking at the equity and the equality between everybody. So
let me just step back a bit and ask you about the voice not being heard. Who needs to hear the voice, and where is it supposed to come from?
Okay, who needs to need it's the entire world that needs to hear the voice. In the G7, in the G20, we've been fighting. Okay, we
They don't want us
have.
there. They don't want Africans there. That's why they've
But
only just opened
but
the
you
door
need
now.
to. But that's the whole point. You need to push yourself. Being there is not a matter of wanting. I think the Bretton Woods system needs to be changed, and it needs to be worked on now. I think we have many elephants in the room.
That's an old argument that's been around for ages, and nobody seems to be paying attention.
But then the world is collapsing. Africa is the lung of the entire planet. You're having serious issues all over the place. Yes, it's talked about, and we're giving up, and we're saying politically it's not acceptable. So let's go on and do our little things. I think it needs to be worked. Scenarios need to be put so that we can deal with it. Let me just finish my last point here on China. China is there are many elephants in the room. The debt, seriously, I mean, there's so many where we're having problems. Right?
I'm feeling a little bit attacked, but no, go ahead.
Actually, you're huge. You're not an elephant. You're a good guy.
Yeah,
You're a good guy.
Of course not.
So China is an elephant, but it's not an elephant for the developing countries as much as it's an elephant for the North, actually. But the other elephants are the IMF and the World and everybody else.
Yeah.
And the debt we are talking about is not the debt with China. We are talking about the debt for the IMF and for the World Bank, which they can cancel if they want, and which I think they need to cancel, because this debt is actually resulting from, I don't want to say abuse, but benefiting from the continent forever. So there is a right to Africa that it needs to get. And if this doesn't happen, we are going to remain in the vicious circle of bad performance, poverty, inability to develop, etc., etc., etc.
Dr. Colley, please respond to that, because she touches on a few things that you're very familiar with.
Well, the World Bank just launched a program to suspend debt service. And this program was approved by the board of directors of the World Bank, and I'm not at the World Bank, so it's the World Bank shareholders approved that. That program was launched in Marrakesh just in October. And it's a decision of the World Bank shareholders. And Africa has, I think, 6 board members in the World Bank, and they participated in these decisions. The ultimate decision makers are the board members, shareholders, and G20. And now, if I may say so, African Union is part of G20. You have a voice there.
Yeah, but the governance system is actually under the control of the biggest players there. That's the whole issue. That's the whole issue. So this is why
well, maybe you should then work through African Development Bank. That's your institution.
And why not benefit from the World Bank? Because it is the World Bank. It's for everybody.
Why don't you work through African Development Bank? You have majority shareholder, and you have an African
But
president.
why are you taking us out of the World Bank umbrella? It's our right.
You're not. I'm not taking.
But is it really your bank?
The African Bank?
Yeah.
The World Bank, is it really your bank, though?
It's everybody's bank. It's part of the system that was created after the Second World War.
But
Okay, I'm going to go to Akebe for a second and then come to these 2 gentlemen.
Yeah, I mean, one thing we need to agree is that the Bretton Woods institutions were created after World War II, almost 8 years back, with a different global economic structure and power structure. Time has changed, and they need to be changed. World Bank, we know that the president of the World Bank is appointed by the US, and the president of IMF is appointed by European Union.
Yeah.
This shows the old structure. And the issue also about fair representation of developing countries is not going to be resolved by having one person at G20, Africa Union, being represented as in the G20 club. What can one individual do? We need to look at the international governance system related with investment, related with trade, related with technology.
Or maybe, I don't mean to interrupt, but forgive me. Or maybe we just need to set our own table and forget those other tables where we are not wanted, where we are fed on crumbs and treated as afterthoughts.
You have rights on those tables. And by the way, Ethiopia and Egypt agree.
But the table we have is the African Union. And despite being a loose organization, but I believe it's making some good progress. And it's putting on the voices. Also, there are deaf ears to the issues raised by the African Union. But it's having an impact. We can see on major decisions linked with geopolitical issues, on major issues that require representations, and it's going to play a much more important role, especially also with the AFCFTA, which is in the process. Okay. So the key point here is, first, we shouldn't blame any external forces for all poverty. A big part of the solution is within our capability, our policies, our strategies. It's the prime issue. We shouldn't just say it's because of the biased international system that Africa is far behind. But we also need to work to improve the global structure as well.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, let's give my panel a round of applause. They are absolutely brilliant. Phenomenal. I'm going to prioritize women because we only have one lady on the panel. But I'd also like to invite these two gentlemen to speak. Are there any ladies who would like to say anything? Yes, ma'am, please. Introduce yourself and make your point.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Bitania. I come from Ethiopia. I'm part of the emerging leaders this year. I have two questions. How does the younger generation play in this conversation that you're having?
Who cares?
Who cares? 75%
Does
of the population.
anybody care about young people?
Do you identify as a young person?
No, I'm just wondering because it doesn't seem to me like anybody cares. Do you feel like that anybody's paying attention to you?
I mean, the major economy is being driven by young people, right?
Because they say Africa is a young continent, young people, young, fresh ideas.
The global south in general has a lot of young people. And in the next 20 years, it's going to be the majority of the population.
But you see, the thing about young people at the moment, the way I see it, it seems like they're othered, they're broke, they're looking for jobs, and nobody seems to be paying attention to them. Isn't that the reality, though?
That is the reality, but we're defying the momentum and redefining what the globe is supposed to be like. That's why we are here, right? As emerging leaders, we're emerging and making new ways of how the global economy should be.
Okay, so what's your second point, ma'am?
Second question is on the BRICS. There are additional countries that have been accepted this year, Ethiopia being one of them, and Egypt also being one of them. And how does that really contribute to this conversation?
Okay, we'll come back to that in a bit.
Thank you for that debate.
Thank you. Make a note of those statements. I hope you don't take your fight to BRICS, you know. But you know, any other? Yes, ma'am.
Complete agreement here.
Yeah, yes, please.
Hi, my name is Mannat, and I'm from India. Well, since we're talking about economic nationalism, I'm very curious to know the panelists' views on these certain inward-looking protectionist green policies that are out there. Green policies such as the IRA by the US or the CBAM by EU. So what are your thoughts on that? And do you think this is a moment or a movement? And will we see a rise of such policies? And what are also, of course, the implications of this for the New South?
Interesting. Any more? Yes, ma'am, at the back. Sorry, guys, I'll come to you, but let's... Yes.
Thank you. My name is Maureen Chibo. I publish Real News Magazine online. You talked about economic nationalism, and I want the panelists to please respond to this. Economic nationalism is gaining momentum because globalization failed and has led to dumping, especially in African countries, and has also negatively affected industrialization. Secondly, the second question is, you talked about populism and social media. Are you looking at the information disorder that social media has brought, due to the democratization of the media space, and then the strands of disinformation, misinformation, and malinformation that is also wrecking or causing chaos in the system. Thank you.
Okay, one last lady before we come back to the gentleman. Yes, one.
I want to go back to the point of
Sorry, what's your name?
Fathia.
Where are you from?
From Morocco.
All right, thank you.
I want to go back to the point of Mrs. Abla, who mentioned a point, the fact that the Southern voice is not loud enough to be heard and so have its issues addressed as a priority. And this takes me back to an example of that attracted the attention of the entire nation, which is the pandemic. And so as soon as that happened, it was loud enough for everybody to pay attention and work as a community towards one goal, finding the cure, which was the vaccine or whatever that is, and we have a lot of theories around that.
But nobody was paying attention to Africa, for example. Was there? Was anybody
But they were paying attention of that specific problem, which is the pandemic. And so my question is, how can we take this example in favor of the economic nationalism and make it work in our favor as northern, southern countries?
Okay. All right, thank you. We'll come back to the audience in a bit, but these 2 points before we continue. Let me start with you, sir.
Let me go first.
Yeah, yes.
Thank you.
Just introduce yourself.
Ottaviano Canuto, Policy Center for the New South, and fantastic conversation. Thank you for that. But I feel compelled to establish some facts. First, the magnitude of the debt of the countries nowadays living through debt distress is not mainly to multilateral institutions. The bulk of the debt, it's data. I worked with this, so I can show you the data. China is a problem on 2 accounts. Any debt restructuring process faces one major difficulty, which is called collective action problem. You have to have the creditors at the table so that you feel confident that if you concede some relief, you're not being foolish for somebody else to take it over. And that's why the Club of Paris was fundamental for remember the HIPC, the first debt relief process, by the way, followed by a multilateral development relief initiative, remember that? So the IMF, World Bank, and so on, they give the relief after the process. If you don't have the creditors all around the table, no one feels confident to provide any relief. The absence of China as the major creditor, even more than the private creditors, makes it impossible to have this concerted. And this has been one important factor for the slow implementation of the G20 debt relief. So China prefers to go on a one-by-one case for its own reasons, but please don't try to shade it out. China, without China in the picture, there is no solution to the problem of debt, okay? First. Second point, Abla said it quite well, that geoeconomic fragmentation is costly. We should not lose sight of this. Even if there are some winners here and there, the amount of losses outweigh the gains. And there are several factors, not all of them were included here. There is a good reference to the climate change policies. There is also the fact that, globalization has been good with respect to poverty, okay? The African lady. The billions of people, the more than 1 billion people that went out of poverty because of globalization, you don't lose that in mind. The backlash against globalization in advanced economies has been a reaction that the populists have taken over because supposedly it was damageful for the Americans and so on. Right. Just please. No one mentioned the issue of the pandemic because that's easy, it's not a major problem, but national security. I was at Brookings when Jake Sullivan, the White House National Security Advisor, comes to us and says, you economists, you don't get it. You talk about economic gains and so on, but whereas there is the national security issue that overweighs you and so on. This should be kept inside at the source. And finally, debt relief and climate finance. We at the Policy Center made a proposal to the T20 showing how it is possible to associate the debt relief with the corresponding creation of fiscal space for some climate finance. The Policy Center, it's possible. We show there in the note. Okay, so the two agendas can be associated. But without China at the table, there's no solution to the debt.
Okay, let's give him a round of applause. Okay. And then, Marcus, before I come back to the panel. I'm particularly interested to hear your thoughts on what was said about China and what's been said about Brazil moving forward as well.
Yeah, tough mission. But yeah.
Just introduce yourself for context.
Marcus Freitas, I'm a senior fellow at the Policy Center and also visiting professor at China Foreign Affairs University. Now, a few things, and I said, when I was listening to Ottaviano, you have to remember that if you have an international system that somehow is trying to exclude you or isolate you, it doesn't make sense for you to do certain things, and that's the Chinese position in many of these things, right? You know, China feels excluded, and it feels isolated many times. Now, my question to the panel is this, and first of all, we have to look into nationalism because certain of the items that perhaps we have in the international agenda is not really in the national interest of countries. For instance, which one is more important for you now? How are you dealing, is infrastructure your #1 priority? And should it be revamped if you are going to grow economically? Isn't infrastructure a little bit more necessary for you to discuss than all of the issues that are related to climate change that are important? But for countries, and that's what I think the Chinese always say, build a road and get rich. Infrastructure is the #1 priority that all countries should have, and perhaps this is something that we're not looking into. Second thing, and I agree with Ottaviano, should we be talking about revamping globalization because it was actually the growth of China that made many of the countries in Africa and in Latin America to grow more than anything else in the 20s and the previous decades that we had. So my question to the panel is this. When you're looking into the legacy of China in your countries, compared to what these institutions have done, how do you evaluate it? And do you think that if China leaves the room, how is it going to be in the future? Who are the replacements that you might have?
Thank you very much to all of you who've made those contributions. I'll come back to the audience in a bit, but Dr. Abdulatif?
Yes, okay, let me answer make comments on the questions and also on what was said here in the given order. The younger generation, of course, the younger generation is the future. And let me tell you something very small, that when COP27 took place in Egypt, in the center we had lots of Zoom meetings with African experts, and one of them was with the youth. And believe me, when you hear them, you see the future, okay? They were saying, do not put us aside, let us be part of the mainstream talking. We can improve the corruption in our governments. We can do a lot of things. So there is a lot that can be said. They're not hopeless looking for jobs. They have to be given the chance. It's a very young, especially in Africa. On the BRICS question and adding members, for me it's very clear, being a member of the BRICS is not an issue of an economic gain or having partners for more trade. We already have trade agreements with everybody in the world. For me, the BRICS is a way of getting together in order to be heard in the world, because the present system is like a small box that's trying to fit an elephant again. I mean, I'm into elephants today, all right? And the elephant does not fit in the box. So everybody is getting together to try and do something and manage it. And in that sense, Egypt being part of this is a win. Ethiopia being part of this is a win. Everybody have their issues. The EU are fighting all the time with each other. But I think the common ground of being part of a group that can be powerful, especially that now has reserves, oil reserves and population, I think it's very interesting. On the green policies, on CBAM, and on what's happening in the United States, these are not bad because they're improving the condition of the world as far as the climate is concerned. But the issue for the developing countries is being forced to deal with this a bit too fast. It will help them by force, start their own green projects, but they will need the help of the North in having access to the technology, in covering part of the cost, again, out of obligation, that those countries are on the path of development, forced to go green and forced to supply the green demands, okay, when they haven't completed their own development. So their starting point is way weaker than what the developed countries went through. On the globalization and the benefit for Africa, I want to differentiate between two things. I want to differentiate between the institutions which are specialized, like FAO, UNICEF. Okay? These have definitely done a lot for Africa. But the failure, the big failure, is very clear in the UN Council, in the World Bank, and particularly in the IMF. And these, with their policies right now, they're holding back the country. So they are in a vicious circle of poverty that's very difficult to get out of. On the social media, the democratization and the democratization space and the wrong information, I think democratization was good because even if there is wrong information from one side, the others have the chance to go with the right information. And we've seen this a lot with Gaza and what's happening there. I think this was an example, not economic, but it tells you a lot. There were things happening, there were other things, realities happening, and the social media helped show the reality, as a matter of fact. Finally, on the voice not heard and the pandemic, and I disagree with the example because the pandemic was actually a proof that Africa was at a disadvantage. They were not vaccinated. They were not given the copyright to produce their own vaccination. We started the pandemic believing that everybody on Earth has to be vaccinated for us to be protected. Then suddenly everybody on Earth became the Western world, and we were not there. On China, I agree that China is a problem, but I'm saying two things. One, start by canceling the debt with the IMF and the World Bank. Let them sit on the table with I know even if it is small, the fact, I agree completely with what you said, the fact that China is excluded, it is hated. IMF can negotiate and can make a difference and help them settle things with the developing world. As long as they are rejected, and we still hope that the earth opens and swallow them, then they will never sit around the table. And we will not live happily ever after.
Thank you very much. Dr. Colley?
Two quick points. Because there are a lot of thoughts here, I'll focus on two. One, I'm also a professor in China. I go there quite often. I've written a number of books on China. With due respect, China is not going anywhere. They're not going to leave the world. They're the biggest trading nation in the world. They are interdependent. My own humble judgment is China is not leaving the world system. They are interdependent. They are the biggest trading nation for Japan, for Korea, for India, even for the US. They've gained from the rest, trading with the rest of the world. Yes, they're a competitor, but they'll stay in the system. They want to gain more influence, correctly so. But they'll stay in the system. So don't worry, they are not leaving. Okay?
But he says that they feel isolated. Is that right?
Yeah, they are isolated.
You don't
No,
agree
they're
that
not isolated. I've been in the board. I've watched them. They're pushing correctly.
How can two professors on China disagree on
right?
this?
Okay.
On this one thing.
I talked to the policymakers. They just spoke at a big conference in China. And they were seeking my views. I'm sure the way they are, seeking your views. They're not isolated. Yes, they would like to have greater share, as would like India like a greater share.
Let me ask, is it a case of China sort of setting its own table and getting into more bilateral relationships and developing those and not necessarily?
Yeah, they're trying to.
Is that working for them?
Look at AIB. I know the president of AIB. He's co-chair of my forum. But AIB, every single project is co-financed with the World Bank or ADB. They don't do their own country analysis. They're dependent on international institutions. So they're not setting their table. That's the fact, reality.
So what is their contribution to this debt problem, in your interpretation?
They're the biggest bilateral debtor in the world, and I couldn't have said it better than what he said. They need to participate in the they signed off on the G20 principles, how to solve the debt problems. In Saudi Arabia, they need to do it. Without that, the world's debt problem can't be sorted. Let me go to the second point, right? Because there are a lot of other things to say. Trade. What we have to recognize that the global poverty dropped in the last 50 years because of globalization, and the jobs moved from developing countries, not only to China, first to Korea, and then Indonesia, to Malaysia, then China, now Vietnam, even India. Globalization has been good for developing countries. Trade is good for developing countries. Our colleague from Mexico made a very good point yesterday. Developing countries, instead of opposing WTO, which has been historic role of Brazil and India, have to now turn around and say, it's good for us, WTO is good for us, we should support trade. Okay? The president, the director general of WTO made a very good point. She's a good friend of mine, Ngozi. Despite all the talk about de-risking and et cetera, the global trade is still growing. It's good for us.
Did someone talk about dumping in Africa? Yes. Yeah, you talked about that. Because what is the nature of the trade? Is it going to China? What does that look like?
It's not fair, but it is still good. We can improve it. We can refine it. But let's not throw the baby with the bath water. That's the point. We have to think seriously. Trade has been good, but at the same time, it's also correct that instead of Africa exporting raw cocoa, why can't we make chocolate and have more value added?
That's been the conundrum for a very long time.
Yeah, but this is what we need to think about it. Instead of saying just we will not export any cocoa.
Interesting. And Akebe, everybody here seems to disagree with you in your position on China.
On the China issue, I think there is
look at your country, the biggest debtor to you.
No. I'm telling you the fact. IMF report, its share was 12%. So the key problem here is we are not talking based on evidence. On China, Africa, we had conducted a serious research which was published based on evidence, and then this was published, contributed by all scholars from the West. And I think Chris Alden is also here among those researchers. The key point is China's investment, involvement in trade, etc., has positively contributed when we refer to Africa. But also, more importantly, if China is contributing 35% to annual GDP growth of the world level, everyone is benefiting from this process. So undermining the role of China is not going to help, because if we are going to inventorize what the other Western countries are doing, we may raise many, many concerns on the political field as well as on the economic field. We can just see at the Sahel-Sahara, what is happening. So a key for us as Africans, I'm looking from an African perspective. Africa is marginalized in terms of its contribution in global manufacturing, value added, in trade, etc. What we want as Africans is to create jobs for the millions and millions, hundreds of millions, young workforce. What we need is to develop manufacturing, industrialization. And China is so important because if you want to study piano, you go to the pianist. And if 27% of world's manufacturing is clustered in China, China is part of those investors that Africa needs to attract, in addition to Europe, in addition to the US. So this is one key point.
What about local investors?
Local investors is always a main strategy to focus. No one limits you to provide them support. The key point is, let's forget the national identity of this origins of FDI, for instance. If we have to create jobs, By 2050, 800 million new young workforce will be joining in Africa, which means we have to create 30 million jobs every year. These jobs are not going to come in manufacturing, in agriculture, because agriculture, as productivity improves, will be moving to urban area, and while output increases, the employment level will diminish. So where do we create these jobs is a key point. And one key part of the solution is African countries, governments should focus on improving the conditions for productive investment. Again, I'm talking productive investment, especially manufacturing or high-value services or high-value agriculture, so that we can create more jobs, so that we can add the value addition in exports. If we look at the China-Africa trade, for instance, most of the exports, the same like it's being exported to Europe, is not value added, and machinery are being imported. Okay, so how do you change this is a key point.
Which African country is getting it right at the moment?
Pardon?
Which African countries are getting it right?
Everyone is trying to work on it. But the key point is, in terms of principle, what do you have to do if you have to create jobs, if you have to create manufacturing? You have to attract, and you have to target all countries. You shouldn't exclude India. You shouldn't exclude even Sri Lanka or any other country. We have to work, because that is where change is going to come. Then I would like to comment on the green transformation issue, on the green policy. My view, this is a very important point. The Inflation Reduction Act, which is $1.2 trillion, is quite important for green transformation, for managing climate change. Also, the main focus is in the US. It contributes to the global green transformation. I also, again here, I would like to point, the most major transformation happening in the green transformation is in terms of EV production, in terms of renewable energy production, that has helped us to slide costs by 90% in the last 10 years, is by China as well. China is the one contributing to green transition. So whatever is happening in green transition in the US, whether it will continue or not, will depend on the next campaign, because we know that on the campaign trail, Trump has clearly announced that he will reverse IRA, but if this policy continue, then it will have a positive impact.
All right, let's give my panel a round of applause. That round of applause is how I make sure you're still awake, by the way. We have about 15 minutes to go. And by the way, at the end of this session, please remain seated because the next session will start immediately. Do you have any thoughts? Any thoughts? Yes, sir, at the back.
Yeah, hi, my name is Maxim, I'm from Spain, and I'd like to know what's your opinion on international tax cooperation? Like, do you think it's viable or desirable that the international society moves to fight fiscal competition, base erosion, profit shifting, and how can we do it?
Okay,
thank you.
Excellent. And yes, sitting next there.
Thank you very much. My name is Lao Ejala from Nigeria. And my question is, what is wrong with economic nationalism? What are we doing amongst ourselves in Africa? What is the percentage
Nigeria is the king of economic nationalism.
That's where we are guilty of what, you see, we come here, we talk about the others. But what have we done to actually move amongst ourselves in Africa? It's a big problem. We've had AD2023. What have we done about it? We must first love ourselves, look inward. How can we strengthen ourselves? As Africa or as Nigeria? You said what?
As Africa or as Nigeria? What do you...
Forget about Africa and Nigeria. We are guilty within Nigeria ourselves. You talk about China, African debt. Who negotiated those transactions? How are we doing? So I think once you must heal yourself first. If I were in their shoes, I'll protect my people. What are we doing to our next you know, the things we have within ourselves.
I think it's
just want we
because
should
of
look at
people
those
think
things.
like you that we are here gathered trying to.
Those are just the
unravel this.
thought that I think we should look at it. Thank you.
Excellent. Very, very interesting indeed. Yes, ma'am. If we can get the mic to her, please.
Hello, my name is Khadija. I'm from Belgium, and I'm one of the members of the emerging leaders this year. Just to basically jump on what this gentleman just has said, what is our responsibility in the Global South with regards to the creation of that debt?
What is our responsibility?
Yes, our responsibility in the Global South.
And then there are hands on the other side. There's a lady behind there. There's a lady in the corner there. And then we'll come to you in a moment, sir.
Hello, my name is June. I'm from Kenya. I'm one of the emerging leaders. I just wanted to ask Mr. Mituku, you say that agriculture cannot be one of the sectors that creates the most jobs in emerging markets because of automation. But then in emerging markets, especially Africa, agriculture is one of the main sources of income. So how does it mean that there are no other avenues of creating jobs in agriculture except farming? Thank you.
Rabia Mukhtar, a Policy Center for the New South. Fascinating discussion. If you look at what the Western, Northern, whatever business model reached, we reached a stage where climate is a problem, is an issue, pollution, you name it. Is there an opportunity for the Global South to do it right? And rather than racing for that seat on the table to do business as usual, can we just reinvent a new business model?
This is exactly my question. Shouldn't we set our own table, isn't it right?
I mean,
is that what you're thinking?
No, I'm thinking a new business model that respects environment, that respects human health, ecosystem health, that really get rid of the current growth model that get us where we are today. I'm not talking about a financial institution. I'm talking about do it right, that is, in a way, have a business model that respects all of creation that's surrounding us, human health, ecosystem health, that we kind of transcend the current business model that has failed us.
That's interesting, very interesting. And then there's a lady in the corner there, please.
Hello, my name is Ale. I'm Egyptian, and I'm emerging leader. I do agree that China is filling a vacuum in Africa, particularly with all the infrastructure. If we look at the investments that have been happening the past years compared to the U.S., I think like the U.S.'s interest in Africa just like was delayed by even 20 years. My question is like looking at the BRICS. Do you think this model will be able to enable the Global South cooperation, or it's just multilateralism like the IMF, World Bank, and same institutions?
Is it just another organization?
Yeah, to serve different political powers within the same structure. So I'm looking at here not only the political interests, I'm also looking at the structure of implementation to develop the continent in general.
Interesting. I have room for 2 more questions to you, sir, and then I'll come to you.
Hi, Chris Alden, LSE. I just wanted to echo what Kebi had been saying about commercial debt is the larger portion of the debt Africa owes at this stage. But I also want to raise another question, which surprises me we haven't talked about, which is the idea is that Chinese lending, panacea or not, problem or not, is dropping off considerably and has since 2019. To Africa, to Latin America. So I just think that...
What have you found in your work? What's the explanation for that?
It seems to be fueled by the fact of difficulties in restructuring it, payments, repayment problems, and of course it occurs just on the eve of the COVID crisis, which also brought about a suspension in lending on most countries' parts. So I think that this picture we're talking about is one that is in transition, it's changing. And so looking at China to be the major, as I said, panacea or otherwise, is not really what's happening today. We're not seeing the same level of lending as we had over the previous decades.
Interesting indeed. And then one last question.
Hi everyone, my name is Yusuf, I'm from Morocco. And you touched on industrialization being an issue in African countries. Wouldn't the primary issue be the lack of economic integration, regionally at least, whether it's Southern Africa, Northern,
Is there a lack of integration? Is there?
Lack of economic integration. So
there is organizations like the East African Community, SADC.
That's the only
ECOWAS.
good example is ECOWAS. I think that's the only good example. But you have like North Africa is notoriously known for barriers between the Maghreb region, Eastern Africa to some extent as well. Southern Africa, I mean, if you remove South Africa and a couple of neighboring countries, and that doesn't encourage in itself the industrialization or the creation of any type of production, primarily because of the size of the market. So if you have, let's take for example, Morocco as a 30-40 million consumer market. If you add Algeria, Tunisia, maybe up to Egypt, you've got about 300 million people.
Okay.
I think that would...
All right, thank you very much to all of you. I just want to start with you. Yeah, we have 7 minutes left, so 2 minutes each.
I would like to focus on the 3-4 questions that was inward-looking. We have to develop agriculture. Our leaders should not go to Ukraine or Moscow to beg food. We have to be able to produce, and Kenya is one good example where horticulture production and exports also is being produced. And we need to put more resources, we need to give it more priority. But we are talking about billions, about hundreds of millions of job seekers. So the most productive agriculture sector in the world is the US. But it's only 1% of the population that is deployed in that. So that was what I wanted to say. The more productivity increases, the number of employment will decrease. So we need to find to create industrial capability. And this is also linked with the issue which my brother raised. FCFTA, we have created a free trade zone area as a modality. But the key point is, what do we want to trade? If we are not manufacturing, if we are not producing, what do we want to trade? So this brings us back to the productive capacity, to the issue of job creation within Africa. And this brings us to the policy, development strategy of African governments. We are only talking about Africa as a group. But ultimately, even if external resource is going to be used, it will depend on the politics and the policy dynamics of respective country. And this is where we need to focus. And I also agree that Africa has a perfect opportunity to champion carbon neutral industrialization.
Right.
We are just starting from scratch. Its manufacturing ratio is about 10% of all GDP across the continent. So we are going to build a manufacturing. And we have an opportunity to make it greener, to make it carbon neutral, so that we don't just grow and then try to clean like what the Chinese or others are trying to do. So that is a perfect opportunity, and I believe there is huge opportunity for that. And those countries also who are dependent on fossil oil economy, like Nigeria or Angola, at some time, this is going to phase out. So the more diversification, economic diversification, they start from now, the better they will be positioned. And this is what our conversation should focus.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Colley.
3 very quick points. First, going back to the question you asked about Belt and Road, why the lending had dropped recently. We just published a book of what's the latest status of Belt and Road, and that's what I was talking about in China. And the reason is very simple. The Chinese have been reflecting on their experience with Belt and Road in the first 10 years. And they discovered that while many projects, including in Africa, were technically good projects, including the railroads they built, the dams they built, financially and economically, they were not up to the snuff, and those projects are not able to service the debt.
Wow.
And as a result, the Chinese banks and Chinese policymakers have decided to pull back. And 2 years ago, the lending was about 1/4 of what it was at peak years in 2019. So the lending has dropped like a rock. And I don't see it resuming. It's true in Kenya, it's true in Zambia, it's true in Ethiopia, it is true in Pakistan, it's true in Sri Lanka, and I can keep going. And what is basically happening is they're refinancing very slowly, and that's why the numbers are very, very low. And that's my projection. It's not going to recover in a big way because...
You don't think it will recover, no?
No, because the projects are not there, viable projects not there. That's point number one. Secondly, on a more positive way, you asked what is the way forward in terms of greening. One very practical idea. Majority of Africans in sub-Saharan Africa still don't have 24/7 power. How can you teach children if they don't have power, if they can't go to school? But there's plenty of sunshine. The price of solar power, wind power has gone down tremendously. So Africa can leapfrog in sub-Saharan Africa and use solar power, which has very low distribution costs. Instead of building power plants based on fossil fuels, build distributed solar power outlets in villages, in distant locations.
Still expensive.
Much lower, thanks to the Chinese, by the way, solar powers. And you can have small ones. It's being done all over the world, whether it's Germany, whether it's elsewhere in Europe, whether it's in the US, it can be done. I think that's something which should be done. And third, I want to echo what Arcabis said, agriculture. Long ago, we looked at why Soviet Union collapsed and China prospered. The Chinese emphasized agriculture, while the Soviets emphasized industrialization. Agriculture creates jobs in local area and feeds people's mouth. And I think there is no reason why Africa should be importing more than 50% of its food. I think Africa should be emphasizing more food production and food security.
Thank you very much. I'll give the last word to you.
Thank you.
Dr. Abdel Latif.
Actually, I have 4 points to make. First of all, the question on the international tax cooperation. The idea is good, but if it happens within the wrong framework in the world, then it's going to be unfair. That's the whole point. It's the issue of fairness.
It goes back to the financial infrastructure as it exists, the architecture as it exists.
Exactly. Economic nationalism, what's wrong with economic nationalism? There is nothing wrong with it if it's done by those who need it to grow without hurting the others. We are focusing on economic nationalism as almost a political position that's happening from the north and hurting everybody else. We need to heal ourselves, agreed completely. We have the African countries, for example, there's a need for capacity building, improved governance, etc., but they never had that chance. Just enough to know that the French-speaking countries in Africa, their currencies are still printed until today in France. This is not normal. This continent is still colonized. So let's face this as we talk about Africa working. Also on Africa, industrialization, definitely why not produce chocolate, etc. But to industrialize, we need energy. Solar energy cannot be used, and this is proven scientifically, for industrialization. For industrialization, you need something like green hydrogen, something that burns like the fossil fuel.
It can be used for education.
Yes, it can be used for education. You have 600 million people who do not have clean cooking or do not have energy. But I'm talking about industrialization. Africa has the right to develop and have what it needs to be able to develop. Last point.
Fossil fuels?
Fossil fuels? No, not natural gas, which is still classified in between. But I'm saying they have to have this right. You cannot, because of the issue with Ukraine, suddenly Germany said that coal is good and sweet and it's perfectly all right. And so it's just like opening the earth and swallowing China. Last word on the round table. Why not have our own table? It's a great idea. I'm all for it. But the concern is the following. You have your own table. You have an ecosystem that's good for the climate. But the rest of the world is doing something else. This own table cannot operate alone. It has to operate within the framework of the entire world. And this is why you need full reform. And the full reform requires efforts in parallel with everything else related to climate finance and everything. It needs efforts in order to raise the voice of the South and change the international economic system.
This has been fantastic because we didn't agree on most things. Thank you. Thank you very much. The panelists, absolutely brilliant. And just in case you're wondering, Akebe, he asked me to call him by his first name. That's sufficient. He's a former minister in Ethiopia, and he's currently with SOAS. And then, of course, Professor Harinder Kohli, founding director and chief executive, Emerging Markets Forum. And very importantly, last but not least, Dr. Abla Abdel Latif, who is executive director, director of research, the Egyptian Center for Economic Studies. Listen, my podcast is called Africa Daily. We have about 800 episodes on there. Please look for it. It's interesting. We'll cover everything on Africa, and download it and tell your relatives all about it. It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
On cross-regional
Ladies and
cross-sectoral
gentlemen,
issues.
please remain
Over
seated.
400
The
high-level
next plenary
participants will
session,
gather from
What's
more
on the
than 80
Back Foot,
countries to delve into this year's
Authoritarianism,
theme,
Democracy
More
and
Assertive Atlantic,
Populism,
its
today
meaning for the
will
world.
now begin.
Same as every
As a
edition,
reminder,
the conference will
translation
allow for different
headsets are
session formats.
available.
Over
The